This
Rosetta
week we're
Stones of the
joined by the
John F.
fantastic
Kennedy
producer and artist
assassination. The
Damon
analysis
Reyes.
of 3 different well-recorded
Damon,
and
it's great
documented
to have
events
you in
will
the
eventually
studio.
be credited with discovering the actual solution to the assassination of President John Kennedy. Remember this for the rest of your life. The Winnipeg Airport Incident, the Raleigh Phone Call, and the Manchurian Candidate by Richard Condon. As improbable and as amazing as this might seem to you at first glance, remember this for the rest of your life. Big Daddy Warbucks was Colonel Wycliffe Preston Draper, and Little Orphan Annie is Tsar Anastasy Vonziatsky. John F. Kennedy was president of all of us, and the truth about his death belongs to all of us. Jim Garrison. For those who are not familiar with the story of the Richard Giesbrecht incident, I would refer you to the third decade, now called the fourth decade, published by Dr. Jerry Rose, professor of sociology at State University, New York. Fredonia, New York, 140634A. Detailed description of articles written originally by Peter J. Whitney of Abbotsford, British Columbia, Canada. Briefly, it is a fascinating account of a meeting that took place in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada on February 13, 1964 at the Winnipeg Airport. A person describing himself as merely a Canadian businessman on a trip, Richard L. Giesbrecht, allegedly accidentally overheard a conversation among 3 strangers discussing what he believed to be the financial payoff for the perpetrators of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy the previous fall. This could be the most important and significant conversation that was ever overheard, accidentally or otherwise, in the recorded annals of modern history. I believe that I have solved a major segment of this conundrum and that the solution to the JFK mystery is very close at hand. Join me now for part 2 of the planned trilogy, JFK, The Final Solution. Part 1 was titled, Red Scares, White Power, and Blue Death, Fascism Draped in a Patriotic Flag. Part 3, as of this moment, remains untitled. The Tale of 3 Führers, a clerical fascist demagogue, the Tsarist Russian Führer, and an American master race proponent and Hitler clone, could also be titled, Big Daddy Warbucks and Little Orphan Annie. After Wycliffe Preston Draper, who was the model for Big Daddy Warbucks, and Tsar Anastas Andreevich Vonziatsky, also known affectionately as Annie. If my interpretations of the identities of the persons, places, and things discussed at that meeting are correct, then Kennedy was killed by an international cabal of right-wing extremists with linkages to some of the most fascist former Nazis and Nazi sympathizers ever assembled in the history of man-rule. The planning, financing, and direction was in all likelihood headed by none other than wax-renowned Nazi sympathizer Reverend Gerald L. K. Smith of Christ of the Ozarks, near Eureka Springs, Arkansas, founder of the Christian Nationalist Crusade, publisher of the anti-Semitic, racist publication, The Cross and the Flag. With the complete knowledge of Willis A. Carto of the Liberty Lobby and financed by Wycliffe P. Draper, sponsor of the racist Draper committees within WAC, founder of the eugenics-based Pioneer Fund, and a major shareholder in first the Draper Company and later Rockwell International, that was one of the primary beneficiaries of the MX and the Minuteman missile programs that began in the late 1960s shortly after the corporate takeover of Draper by Rockwell Standard. The person identified by Giesbrecht as speaking with an Eastern European accent and having a pockmarked neck and reddish skin and hair was absolutely and positively Count Anastas Andreevich Vonziatsky, Worldvojt, or Führer of the Russian fascist organization, the headquarters of which was located in Harbin, Manchuria, China since the 1930s. The Anglo-speaking persons involved in the Giesbrecht events were all dedicated current or former Nazis or neo-Nazis masquerading as professional anti-communists. The Canadians involved with the meeting in Winnipeg and the JFK assassination were most likely either neo-Nazi leader Ronald A. Gostick of the privately run anti-Semitic front called the Canadian Intelligence Service, or Patrick J. Walsh of the Liberty Lobby, who wrote for the American Mercury in Wichita, Kansas, and an Australian professional anti-Semite Eric D. Butler, a longtime associate of Australian Dr. Fred Schwartz and his Christian anti-communist crusade. All of these Nazis dressed in anti-communist veils had direct ties to Wycliffe P. Draper and associations with one or more Liberty Lobby affiliates, and belonged somewhat later to the World Anti-Communist League via the North American Regional World Anti-Communist League. As a recently discovered side note of perhaps major importance, the following tidbit is offered as likely corroborating evidence for the thesis that is developed herein. George de Mohrenschildt apparently used the pseudonym Philip Harbin during some of his covert operations, including the one in Haiti regarding Papadoc de Vallier. Innocent enough on the surface, but it was pointed out to me by Joan Knapp that George's wife was born in Harbin, probably when it was still called Manchukuo instead of Manchuria. That would make the de Mohrenschildt's identification as probable White Russian Nazi collaborators even more significant. Recall that his cousin, the Baron Constantin Maydel, was arrested and convicted, I believe, during World War II as a Nazi spy. What this implies is absolutely immense. Jean de Mohrenschildt was born to parents who had been exiled from Tsarist Russia and chose to live out their diaspora among like-minded anti-Bolsheviks with strong Tsarist backgrounds among the staunchest of the White Russian expatriates, where von Ziotsky set up his headquarters as Vajda of the entire White Russian fascist organization. George de Mohrenschildt would have had to be not only intimately familiar with the von Ziotsky orgs and his operations, but the person himself. In fact, both Baron Maydel and the de Mohrenschildts would have been direct employees of that sinister organization from the very early days of its existence, since it was von Ziotsky that ran every White Russian expatriate spy in North America, including Canada and Alaska. Von Ziotsky's connections to both the training and launching of multiple assassins into Bolshevik territory to commit murders or acts of retaliation, retribution, and revenge against the administration that was keeping him from returning to his Russian homeland becomes even more significant. It implies that Richard Condon knew whereof he spoke regarding the Manchurian connections described in The Manchurian Candidate, that Condon deliberately inserted von Ziotsky's persona into the Lou Amjak character in the novel, and that the Russian Roulette and Manchurian Candidate references made by Dick Russell's informant were quite likely to Anastas von Ziotsky's favorite gambling reference, and to the probable site of the show and tell assassination demonstrations described by Condon. Does this mean that the probability that Oswald had a confirmed history as a hunter of fascists, at least according to Marina Oswald, is greatly increased? Probably. Regardless of what role Oswald actually played in the Texas Schoolbook Depository, it is my opinion that he had a definite background as a hijack-programmed assassin. He probably began his career as a killer of fascists with Bogdan Stashinsky for the Communists, Bandera, Rebet, etc., and ended up working for the fascists as a killer of democracy and a contributor to the lifting of the Iron Curtain, which was both Anastas A. von Ziotsky's and George de Mohrenschildt's stated lifetime goal. Looks like they are going to win out after all, and democracy will be the next to fall to the onslaught of fascism. Divide and conquer. First an onslaught on communism with the witting help of democracy, and then an attack on democracy with the help of the Anti-American Activities Committee members like Newt Gingrich, Jesse A. Helms, J. Strom Thurmond, Thomas F. Ellis, the Steve Forbes and Jack Kemp backer, Richard P. Viguerie, the Robert Morris confidant, and his selected VP candidate in 1976 on George Wallace's American Independent Party ticket, Paul Weyrich, the real brains behind Newt Gingrich. Robert K. Dornan and Company. Get to know these folks, for they will soon call themselves your fearless leaders once martial law has been declared during their well-constructed but completely staged national crisis. Who is the highest-ranking and most powerful fascist sympathizer in America today? Senate Foreign Relations Committee Leader Helms? Senate Armed Services Committee Leader Thurmond? Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich? The leader of the pack? Or someone else? Take your pick. Remember that Gingrich is only 2 heartbeats from the presidency of these United States. You have been officially warned. The contributions to the JFK assassination or the cover-up and the contacts from active or inactive military intelligence were coordinated by Maj Gen Charles A. Willoughby, Army, relieved of duty by President Harry S. Truman, along with Douglas A. MacArthur, Robert Morris, and James J. Angleton, active in the Central Intelligence Agency, later summarily fired by William Coulson. All 3 of the military intelligence specialists shared the unique predilection of being involved with Soviet counterintelligence operations and must have exchanged notes and discussions frequently as a matter of general protocol. This implies that at one time or another in our nation's history, the entire apparatus of our Soviet counterintelligence operations had been completely subverted and dominated by outright fascists or Nazi sympathizers. Just think of it. Who else is better suited to run complex anti-Soviet ops than a dedicated bunch of avid Nazis or Nazi sympathizers? What a country! And we actually invited many former Nazis into our country to help with the missile programs and our anti-Soviet spying operations. What else could we have expected? Operation Paperclip was one prime example of how to guarantee relinquishing control of your government to alien and seditious forces. Wycliffe Preston Draper, referenced in both the Manchurian Candidate and the Winnipeg Airport incident, also known as the Richard Giesbrecht incident, will someday be considered even more traitorous than Benedict Arnold himself. Now I am beginning to understand what Paul Weyrich meant when he said, listen very well to this quote. To me, it is one of the most mind-bending quotes ever said by any person in the history of mankind. When the roles played by the Pioneer Fund and Wycliffe P. Draper in various historical events during the 20th century are finally disclosed and fully understood, all of the world's history books will eventually have to be rewritten entirely from scratch. Draper used his personal fortune, which began as an inheritance of over $10 million in 1924 for himself and his sister, to advance whatever funding was required to the conspirators, and later cashed out when Rockwell purchased both the entire Draper Company and North American Aviation in the very same month that Gordon Novel was blackmailing someone in the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA about some pending event which was scheduled to occur in March of 1967. This event was apparently scheduled to occur on some rapidly approaching date of apparently critical importance to everyone associated with the JFK assassination plot. The actual draft of this letter is reproduced later in this document for anyone to corroborate. What was the date of the Rockwell takeover of Draper? March 22, 1967. What amount was involved? Over $100 million in Rockwell preferred stock, which paid tax-preferred dividends to any corporate holders and gave high yields to any individual owners. When was Gordon Novel indicted by Jim Garrison? March 23, 1967 QD. After his younger sister, who married a nephew of William Howard Taft in about 1924, died mysteriously in about 1927, many persons close to the family believed that Wycliffe killed her to get her share of the inheritance. All of the depraved, abominable, and detestable miscreants who served as the plot masters have been either self-admitted admirers of Hitler, proponents of World War II isolationism, opponents of the Nuremberg tribunals, historical Holocaust revisionists, or outright supporters of other Hitler policies and practices like blatant racism and sexism and pseudo-scientific racial eugenics, anti-Semitism, anti-unionism, anti-communism, anti-liberalism, and anti-United Nations interventionism, and comparable fascist policies. The people who had Kennedy killed have long represented the face of fascism in America and around the globe. Draper was involved in at least 4 other assaults against democracy during his lifetime. Gerald L. K. Smith was involved in 3 other political assassination attempts and/or attempted coups d'état before the JFK caper that he orchestrated in his extended career as a fascist terrorist, anarchist, religious reactionary, and the mastermind of previous assassinations and besmirchment campaigns. It makes the term clerical fascism seem almost too tame for the level attained by his lifetime of reactionary revolution and his carefully orchestrated and quite heinous deeds. 1. The assassination of Huey P. Long. The father of Senator Russell Long. Huey was the governor of Louisiana in the early 1930s. The deed was blamed on Carl Weiss, who was summarily executed at the scene of the assassination by Gerald L. K. Smith's armed henchmen in a volley of bullets before he could even launch one word of protest or face a trial. The Benito Aquino assassination followed this exact scenario, where a hand-picked scapegoat was silenced on the tarmac outside the Aquino plane before even one newsman was permitted to leave the plane to cover the Benito Aquino homecoming. I have it on good authority from an excellent source and a former State Department career officer, who prefers to remain anonymous at this time, that Ray S. Klein was stationed in the Philippines with the CIA at the time of this murder. This person was also stationed in the Philippines at that time. It was common knowledge there. The attempt against FDR in the late 1930s, organized by Ukrainian fascist Count Anastas Vonziatsky, called the General Smedley A. Butler coup. It involved General of the Armies Douglas A. MacArthur and Major General Charles A. Willoughby. Count Anastas Vonziatsky was involved with this caper as well, but did not receive an indictment or receive any jail sentence whatsoever at that time. 3. The General George Van Horn Mosley and Vonziatsky-inspired coup d'etat in 1942 against FDR, which was to install Senator Burton K. Wheeler of Montana as the President of the United States. Count Anastas Vonziatsky was also involved in this little caper and got a jail term for his efforts. The failure of our benign democracy to have this despicable miscreant deported led to the murder of John F. Kennedy. It was Goebbels himself who predicted that the freedoms extended by democracy would be the cause of its eventual downfall. He vowed never to grant those same freedoms after fascist totalitarianism wins. 4. The Hollywood actors and screenwriters blacklisting campaigns in the late 1940s before McCarthy, which were vehemently opposed by Frank Sinatra, who also starred in The Manchurian Candidate. In return, Sinatra has been unfairly castigated as an alleged member of the mafia by the right wing. This has been one of the more despicable tactics of the right since the days of Sacco Vanzetti. In fact, I was actually accused by one of the more paranoid and demented JFK researcher dinosaurs of also being a mafia member when in fact I am neither of Italian origin nor engaging in any illegal activity or immoral accusations. And you wonder why the reputation of assassination researchers has sunk to an all-time low. It just makes the job twice as difficult for the legitimate, open-minded, and unbigoted researchers. 5. The implication, persecution, and framing of Alger T. is for his alleged pro-communist affiliations with the assistance of Draper crony Nathaniel Whale and Robert Morris associate Whittaker Chambers. Also involved were Draper associates Webster Thayer, who presided over the Dedham, Massachusetts trial, and Henry Goddard, who presided over the Baltimore, Maryland libel lawsuit filed by Alger T. Hiss. Thayer's relatives worked for Draper at the Draper Company, and Goddard was involved with the famous Massachusetts Goddards recently of the Goddard Space Flight Center. Wycliffe P. Draper handpicked both of these judges. 6. The framing and murders of both Sacco and Vanzetti. My very recent discovery regarding both Sacco and Vanzetti and their previous roles as thorns in the sides of the Drapers during the strike against the Draper Company just before or during World War I only serves to cement, beyond the shadow of a doubt, the rationale and motivation behind their choice by Wycliffe P. Draper to be shanghaied and framed during their infamous trial, also in Dedham, Massachusetts by Draper cronies. This is my most recent discovery regarding the case. Vanzetti used to be a union organizer while he worked for the Drapers in Hopedale, Massachusetts in the later years of the second decade of this century, and after being fired for being a union organizer, he came back to lead a very violence-prone strike against the Drapers a few years after he was told to leave the company. Sacco and Vanzetti also led bombing and assassination attacks against the Massachusetts offices of the Mussolini-backed Black Shirts organization, which was their final undoing. The Drapers vowed to exact their own particular version of revenge against Sacco and Vanzetti, just like they would later against Judaism during the Holocaust, Alger T. Hiss during his trials and tribulations, Frank Sinatra during the Hollywood blacklisting campaign, and finally against John F. Kennedy. 7. The persecution campaigns organized by Senator Joseph R. McCarthy of Wisconsin against innocent individuals, which were tantamount to character assassinations of the first magnitude. The character assassinations of the FHR Reich wing today against Clinton and Gore, or anyone else for that matter, should be resisted with the last ounce of energy and the last breath of every person of character and fortitude. Your personal freedom and that of every enemy of the FHR Reich is at stake right now. You can see what their attitude was against FDR and his New Deal program, and you will learn about their attitudes regarding John F. Kennedy. Now at long last, the philosophical progeny of those who killed Kennedy and their de facto leader, the protagonist of The Gingrich That Stole Christmas, old Mr. Scrooge himself, Newt Gingrich of Georgia, and the original perpetrator of the terror on Helm Street, Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina, are finally talking about rolling back the entire New Deal. The Great Society programs and every other democratic social welfare program installed since the time of FDR and JFK. Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, behind-the-scenes cohorts of the Reich wing, Paul Weyrich and Richard Viguerie, Robert Morris VP running mate in 1976, Senators Jesse Helms and J. Strom Thurmond, Representatives Richard D. Armey and Robert K. Dornan, and professional curmudgeon Pat Buchanan together represent the successful reincarnation of fascism in America. Consider yourself forewarned. It is now up to you to do something about these inimical threats to democracy before it is too late. Bet you haven't got the guts to do something about this mess and those who would deposit it in a steamy, smelly pile right on your front doorstep. Do you? Do you? In a touch of either complete irony or as a result of the influence of the Gerald L.K. Smith crowd, Oswald once checked out a book about the assassination of Governor Huey P. Long, where Smith was present at the moment of denouement, and once boasted of enjoying learning how to blow up the Huey P. Long Bridge over the Mississippi River just outside of New Orleans. One you should never forget. Gerald L. K. Smith's level of vitriol and the passion in his diatribes against the Kennedys, which can only be paraphrased here until the actual reference is uncovered again. It represents the most violent quoted attack against the Kennedy brothers that I have ever come across in all the years of my investigations, and it rocketed the Reverend Smith to the top of my suspects list. If you are the least bit squeamish or sensitive, you better hold your ears and close your eyes. The Kennedy brothers are just a bunch of whoremongering, whiskey-swigging bastards and fake Catholics who are trying to take our country away from the white patriotic American Christians just like you and me and hand it over on a silver platter to all of the niggers, the kikes, and all the other foreigners. The typical right-winger you find slithering out from under a rock or growing like a slime mold on some piece of rotting tree bark will usually respond to that quotation with something to the effect of, "That Smith guy must have known the Kennedys." Or, "Yeah, that description was just about right." No wonder Wycliffe P. Draper and numerous other racists, anti-Semites, and xenophobic Nazi sympathizers were drawn like moths to a flame to support the so-called Reverend Gerald Lyman Kenneth Smith from his very early days with the German-American Bund and the pro-Nazi silver shirts and the brown shirts. He was much more than their messiah and their ultimate emotional and philosophical leader. He is the type of person that democracy quite simply has no way to deal with effectively. In fact, he is the type of person who delighted in his attempts at bringing democracy to its knees. Those of his ilk who survive him are continuing their efforts as you sit and read this manuscript. The Richard Giesbrecht incident. Was Giesbrecht our CMP or Interpol? Proposing an internally consistent description or solution to the events that took place in the Winnipeg, Manitoba airport on February 13, 1964 has proved extremely elusive despite the efforts of one of the most indefatigable researchers within the JFK community, Peter Whitney of Abbotsford, British Columbia. As a direct result of both his inspirational contributions to this subject and his selfless offers to assist all of those who asked for help, I am now prepared to describe what I think is a quantum leap toward the eventual final solution to the Giesbrecht incident conundrum. Unfortunately, Peter Whitney has jealously refused to acknowledge the extent of my contributions to the eventual solution of this long-standing mystery, and he remains stubbornly unconvinced about the accuracy of any of my efforts. You can draw your own conclusions after reading all the evidence. Peter, a substitute school teacher, is at this very moment probably working on the solution of another case. Who stole Mary's crayons? I hope for the sake of all of us that it will not take him 25 years to solve this mystery as well. Hypothesis. Those persons present at the Richard Giesbrecht incident, as well as those persons who were referred to during that incident, were all members of affiliates of the quasi-fascist Liberty Lobby of Washington, D.C., and some of them eventually became members of the neo-fascist World Anti-Communist League, while some shared both claims to infamy. WCL was described by John and Scott Anderson in their 1986 epic, Inside the League. In short, the JFK assassination was a joint effort on the part of the international and the domestic fascist networks associated with Charles A. Willoughby, Edwin A. Walker, Spaz T. Riken, H. L. Hunt, Rev. Gerald L. K. Smith, Wycliffe P. Draper, Robert Morris, and James J. Angleton. The international lobbies for liberty, which included the representatives from the White Russian fascist movement, primarily the Ukrainian expatriates, the anti-Castro Cuban exiles, and the representatives from the other English-speaking countries who had direct representation and participation in both Willis A. Carto's Liberty Lobby and as delegates to the conferences of the World Anti-Communist League, Canada, Australia, and England, beginning with the formal inception of WCL in 1966. The first two persons at the Giesbrecht meetings have been identified to my satisfaction. They are Reverend Gerald L. K. Smith, the heavy-set, bushy-eyebrowed character with black horn-rimmed glasses facing Giesbrecht, who was mentioned by his actual name in the Manchurian Candidate, and Count Anastase A. Vonziatsky, the reddish-skinned Arcanian with a badly pock-marked neck, whose persona was given to the character Lou Amjak in the Manchurian Candidate, who was described as having florid skin, a tendency towards boils on the back of his neck, and sandy hair. Vonziatsky's wife had winter homes in both Tucson, Arizona, and St. Petersburg, Florida, according to University of Hawaii history professor John J. Stephan, who wrote The Russian Fascists, which would account for the reddish skin and the sunburned look in mid-February in Canada described by Giesbrecht. The Eastern European attendee also wore the very tropical light beige outfit, as if he were just planning to fly into Canada for a quick indoor meeting in the airport, and then fly back to either Wichita, Kansas, or either one of his points of disembarkation, Arizona or Florida, immediately thereafter the meeting. The third person at the Giesbrecht incident was most likely either one of the two eventual Narwhal Nazis, Canadian Ronald A. Gostick or Australian Eric D. Butler, both long admired by Reverend Gerald L. K. Smith and a frequent correspondent of theirs based on letters filed at the Gerald L. K. Smith collection at the University of Michigan's Bentley Library. This gaggle of potential and probable conspirators had representation, either active or inactive, on naval intelligence, Army intelligence, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Private Canadian Intelligence Service, the American Vigilante Intelligence Federation, and the American Security Council. The latter two firms began as privately funded security agencies collecting and codifying employee and potential employee dossiers. Their primary function was to ferret out communists, left-leaning troublemakers, Union sympathizers, and similarly threatening individuals. The legality of such privately funded security and industrial espionage organizations has been allowed to go almost unquestioned over the years. They have proven to be one of the most serious threats to democracy in the history of the right-wing movement in America. The American Security Council work was primarily for the benefit of the patriarchs and sponsors of the America First Committee, General Robert E. Wood of Sears, Roebuck & Co., and Colonel Robert R. McCormick, publisher of the ultra-conservative right-wing Chicago Tribune and one of the co-founders and sponsors of Wycliffe P. Draper's Human Events yellow journalism tabloid. These smut files of the ASC were partially obtained from Senator Joseph McCarthy's investigators during its inception in 1956. Copies of this data went to like-minded accommodating senators and representatives on H.U.C. and the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, who would put them to good use in assuring that objections to their eventual disposition of John F. Kennedy could be quickly silenced. By focusing on approximately 10 of the references overheard at the Winnipeg airport meetings, I will attempt to perform a historical reconstruction within the limits and scope of material either previously discussed by Peter Whitney during his analysis of these events or recently uncovered by me during the course of my investigations. The implications of this proposed solution on the probable course of the swing of the international political pendulum are massively immense and ominous, if my thesis is only the least bit accurate. And I believe it is much more precise than that modicum of exactitude implies. The self-supporting, internally consistent, and redundantly corroborating nature of the final evidence is above the 95% confidence levels required by most research in the social sciences. The reported Ukrainian name, Romaniuk, Annie or Andy, Mercury, shipments from a city referred to as Newport, a textile operation name containing some type of a fabric reference, Wichita, Kansas. The last name Isaacs or the possessive variation of the first name, Isaacs, a meeting for a company containing the name, worldwide perhaps, to be held in Wichita, Kansas on March 18, 1964, Hoffman, Hauptmann, or Hoffman or Houghton, and the Townhouse Motel or Hotel. This meeting may have been timed for the Ides of March and could have lasted until Wycliffe P. Draper's favorite anniversary celebration date of March 22nd, which will be described in detail later in this document. For those of you with knowledge of Nazism's reliance on the occult and the mystical to spread their terror, March 22nd is apparently a very crucial date for those of their ilk. The Skull and Bones Society at Yale University, according to legend, used room 322 as the location for the initiation rites for new recruits that includes lying naked in a sarcophagus and relating stories of your early sexual conquests. It is also the birthdate of Demosthenes, who created the first organization that relied on skulls and bones as items of adornment during their macabre ritualized rites and chants. And some of these people are running our country now. We are in some really deep and sinister things, my friends. Just to make the challenge a little more interesting, the solution should also be consistent with Peter Whitney's observations in another article that described linkages to the following additional areas. A. The American Nazi Party of George Lincoln Rockwell and miscellaneous neo-Nazi types who could have both domestic and/or international ties in various English-speaking countries. The name, address, and phone number of Don Burroughs, the ANP secretary, was found in Oswald's phone book. B. The Minutemen of Robert DePue and the real Minutemen from the California foothills. Any historical links to the original Minutemen of 1776 would just add more grist for the mill. An alternate name for the real Minutemen was the American Underground, which was run by none other than Major General Edwin A. Walker, who lived on Turtle Creek Drive in New Orleans. Richard Condon in his Manchurian Candidate novel mentions both a location known as Turtle Bay and a group known as the Loyal American Underground, and implies both were keys to the planned assassination in his novel. Walker was in fact head of a group he called the Loyal American Underground. In Winter Kills, Condon uses the same techniques of switching cities. Instead of Philadelphia, Mississippi, where Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman were murdered by the Pioneer Fund crowd, he uses Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on Washington's birthday, February 22nd, as the date of the presidential assassination in his historical novel. C. Some direct affiliation or affinity with WAC or HCUA should also be present, since Robert DePue lobbied hard against the abolition of this organization both before and immediately after the assassination in a message containing veiled threats to congressmen, via his hate-filled propaganda magazine On Target, which had rifle-scope crosshairs on the cover of each issue. It was almost as if he were saying, "Do not even think of abolishing WAC, or you will meet the same fate as John F. Kennedy." Would you be surprised to discover that the final solution to the Richard Giesbrecht conundrum contains all of these required ingredients as well? International neo-Nazis, Minutemen, and WAC, and the common linkage is the reference to the reactionary owner of the textile concern that I personally have recently uncovered, Wycliffe P. Draper. The presence of all of these items in JFK, The Final Solution, which includes the companion volume, Red Scares, White Power, and Blue Death, Fascism Draped in an American Flag, essentially acts as an internally self-corroborating mechanism. The symbols of Gerald L. K. Smith's periodical, The Cross and the Flag, were put on the cover for a purpose. It managed to smoke out the character who called himself Kenneth Smith at the Dallas ASK conference in 1994 at the Adolphus Hotel, where the original Texas conspirators allegedly met to celebrate the murder of John F. Kennedy. What's the frequency? Kenneth Smith, whom one believed was Smith's grandson, was approximately 47 to 50 years old and resembled a young Gerald L. K. Smith almost to the hilt. It is difficult to account for this fact, since Gerald and his wife were unable to produce a natural child, and his only son, who eventually became a golf pro, was adopted. Their son was named Kenneth, after the grandfather, and so was the interloper at the Adolphus Hotel in Dallas at the ASK conference. One hesitates to suggest the macabre and gruesome possibility that Gerald was somehow involved with the insemination of his daughter-in-law because of his failure to produce any other progeny. I am reminded of the remarkable coincidence involving a childhood grammar school friend of mine who was a resident of the nearby orphanage and was named Charles Thurot after Charles Thurot Pickel, perhaps, of the Szczytni Knights of Malta and Hitler's agent in the United States. He was the only blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan physical specimen over 6 feet tall who weighed over 175 pounds in the entire 8th grade, which was considered quite large in the early 1960s. The only other person his size in the entire class was a Cuban refugee named Arturo, who had stayed back 1 year because of the language barrier. He was a constant weightlifter at the young age of about 15 or so. It was almost too eerie to describe when the thought entered my head that this poor guy may have been the result of some sort of a boys from Brazil breeding experiment to create future Hitlers right in the heart of Miami, Florida. His personality was rather surly and sometimes downright nasty, and he was one of the few classmates that we all feared because of his unpredictability and the aggressive edge he always carried like a chip on his shoulder. This could have been because of the fact that he was raised without parents at an orphanage, but others from there who attended our school did not display either his Aryan characteristics or his surly, almost violent demeanor to my recollection. You must realize that these facts mandate that you analyze the implications of my conclusions, and you must take this threat from the right seriously. If they participated in the JFK hit, they are capable of doing anything they want to whomever they wish, whenever they want, given enough time and sufficient financial and political resources. Even if you find reason to quibble about or prevaricate regarding several sections of this attempt at a unified assassination theory, please do not lose sight of the big picture that is being presented. The very future of democracy and the stability of our original republic is at stake here. Believe me, heed my warnings and act accordingly before fascism has sunk its teeth into our very soil. You must defeat the totalitarian, repressive, and anti-democratic agendas of Gingrich, Army, Forbes, Helms, Graham, Thurman, Dornan, and company before they are firmly entrenched as dictators of public policy. Once they have grabbed hold of power like the leeches they are, it will be well-nigh impossible to get them to relinquish their control once they change the rules according to the recipe of Goebbels and Hitler. It is highly likely that one of the persons overheard by Richard Giesbrecht or one of the persons actually discussed in the third person in the Winnipeg, Manitoba Airport meeting in mid-February of 1964 discussing a pending payoff for participation in the JFK assassination was Andrzej Melnyk. His name was pronounced like Andro Minyek by his niece before she was completely aware of the nature of my phone calls. One of the people described by Giesbrecht was a person with an Eastern European accent referred to as Romaniuk. If you are willing to hypothesize for a just moment that Giesbrecht could have heard a series of names which ended with in Romaniuk, you can better appreciate this possibility. The phrase in Romaniuk, when pronounced by a person with an accent, would sound a whole lot like Andro Minyek if you were to ask any reasonable and open-minded person. Andrzej Melnyk was the head of OUN-M, the less militant of the two OUN factions of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. The other faction, OUN-B, was in a shambles due to the fairly recent assassinations of Stepan Bandera in Munich, West Germany on October 15, 1959, and Dr. Lev Rebet in the same city, but on October 12, 1957. Both dates were chosen to be deliberately close to the original Judgment Day at Nuremberg of October 16, 1946. Sort of a commemorative celebration. True assassination researchers will recognize the first date as falling within Lee Harvey Oswald's infamous missing in action period somewhere between England and Finland. If some fascinating speculation or additional hypothesizing is permitted, I would venture to say that Oswald may have helped the second most famous Minsk-trained NKVD-affiliated assassin of this period, Bogdan Stashinsky, on his appointed rounds. Oswald may eventually turn out to be the most famous of them all, although he was certainly not capable of making the kill shot from the sniper's nest on the 6th floor of the Texas Schoolbook Depository. There is substantial evidence to suggest that Oswald may have been asked to penetrate the assassination plot and report back to the staff of Senators Dodd and Eastland of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, as part of the overall ruse being played on him. Recall that Dodd was involved with the request that had Oswald purchase his mail-order Mannlicher Carcano from Klein's Sporting Goods in Chicago as an inside joke by the Ray S. Klein and the Manchurian Candidate, perchance, as well as the mission that Oswald carried out in Clinton, Louisiana, involving the voter registration drive and his job application at the mental institution there. Another anagram that was pointed out to me involves Mannlicher gun and Manchurian, but there are 3 letters remaining without any rhyme or reason, so it must be discarded. The same assassin were apparently used in both cases. Bogdan Stashinsky or the Soviet NKVD confessed to both crimes using the infamous Stashinsky gun that so fascinated H.L. Hunt during the 1960s. The Stashinsky gun was in essence a sort of sophisticated zip gun that looked like an easily concealed pipe bomb. It exploded a canister of potassium cyanide loaded in a hollowed-out shotgun shell at rather close range to the intended victim. The net result to the victim was a heart seizure which was inevitably fatal. In this fashion, the act of assassination was blamed instead on a heart attack, and the perpetrators would escape unnoticed without the noise of a gunshot or the ugly mess associated with a gunshot wound. Stashinsky used this type of tool in 1957 and in 1959, which would have made Richard Condon's use of the anagram Tungwa much more understandable. Tungwa is an anagram for what gun? Since anyone discovered who had been made a victim of the Stashinsky gun could easily be mistaken for someone who had a heart attack. Assassin? What assassin? Gun? What gun? This person must have had a heart attack or a stroke. Later in this document you will learn of H.L. Hunt's preoccupation with this gun that was not really a gun, and in the Bill Boxley memo, you will read of Edgar Eugene Bradley describing a heart attack drug about which he apparently had some direct knowledge. What is the most direct apparent connection to the JFK assassination? The heir apparent to the white Russian-Ukrainian community's efforts at removing the Iron Curtain was none other than Spaz T. Rakin's immediate superior on the American Friends of the Anti-Bolshevik Nations, Yaroslav Stetsko, who attended the Mexico City fascist-dominated WACFL conference in 1958 at the behest of none other than that perennial proponent of democratic ideals, E. Howard Hunt of the Central Intelligence Agency. The mention of the reference overheard by Giesbrecht to Mercury during the same meetings has been postulated by Peter Whitney as being to the American Mercury, which was purchased by the Liberty Lobby's publishing arm, Noontide Press, owned by Willis Cardo and run by Maj Gen Edwin A. Walker, beginning sometime in the mid-1960s timeframe, I believe. The Mercury was once a legitimate magazine started by H.L. Mencken in Baltimore, but it was soon subverted for the purposes of the radical Reich in America. The Canadian neo-Nazi, who also served as the Canadian representative on the Liberty Lobby and as delegate to the WCL conventions, was Patrick Walsh, who also wrote for the American Mercury along with Charles A. Willoughby, Revilo P. Oliver, Edwin A. Walker, and Robert Morris. The Canadian and Australian equivalents of America's best-known hatemonger Willis A. Carto were on a speaking tour across southern Canada starting in the spring of 1964 with Gerald L. K. Lyman Kenneth Smith, the notorious anti-Semite and pro-fascist whose favorite phrase during his almost successful run at a Michigan senatorial seat was, "When chaos comes, I'll be the leader." To those accompanying Smith on the tour of southern Canada were Eric D. Butler of WCL, an Australian version of Willis A. Carto, now Mark Lane's father-in-law for God's sake, and Ronald A. Gostick, another Canadian version of Willis A. Carto and a neo-Nazi from WCL and the Liberty Lobby. According to a reference I was able to uncover recently as part of a real major breakthrough. Remember this quotation, because it was the one that led to the end of the trail in the quest for the solution to the conundrum surrounding the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Eric Butler came to the United States in January 1964, and on the 19th of that month, addressed a meeting of the Citizens Congressional Committee in Los Angeles. The meeting was held under the chairmanship of Gerald Smith. Later that spring, Butler made a tour of Canadian cities under the sponsorship of Ron Gostick, publisher of the anti-Semitic Canadian Intelligence Service and long an admirer of Butler. 3. The physical descriptions, ages, and defining characteristics of the Winnipeg meeting attendees described by Giesbrecht contain some rather astonishing matches with the persons I have identified as the most likely suspects. Defrocked Reverend Gerald L. K. Smith possessed definitively bushy eyebrows and heavy-set build, which were the most pronounced features recalled by Giesbrecht, and Smith matched the age and physical descriptions of the suspect with this marked feature except for the large, heavy-framed glasses. It is quite possible that the heavy-framed glasses were accidentally associated with the wrong man by whomever did the interviews with Giesbrecht. No one is more than 80% to 90% accurate in recording information like this, even if they are highly trained professional investigators, and especially so if they are not. Humans make mistakes. Peter Whitney had not told me during our earliest conversations that the third suspect, a rather large person, 6 feet or taller and weighing over 200 pounds, approximately 35 years old, with a muscular build, fair hair and a boxer's deformed flattened nose, reddish flushed cheeks, appeared to be left-handed with either scars or tattoos on the left hand. Whitney later found a picture of Ronald A. Gostick dated from a few months after the Winnipeg meetings, and the description fits him exactly for all of these features mentioned above, except he was the one also wearing the heavy-looking plastic-framed black glasses. Descriptions or pictures for Patrick Walsh, Eric D. Butler, and Andrej Melnick have not been easy to obtain, but should be forthcoming shortly. Several constables from the Winnipeg Police Service and members of Canada's other anti-extremist organizations have already agreed to assist me in this quest. In Canada, it is against the law to even possess certain types of hate propaganda, or to belong to groups which publish, distribute, or otherwise disseminate such material. Canada still has a thriving democracy even with these modest restrictions against those who would attempt to destroy that very democracy. All of us in the USA could learn a valuable lesson from them. These organizations already have all of my collected evidence relating to the Richard Giesbrecht incident and the JFK assassination, so their efforts can proceed unabated and uninterrupted regardless of any other attempted disruptions. The third suspect present at the meeting could be Eric D. Butler, if the names of the participants on the tour of southern Canada in the late winter of 63 to 64 until sometime in the spring of 64 in. The report on the John Birch Society by Epstein and Forster is part of the solution to the puzzle, which I believe it is. One of the 3 suspects had a rather pronounced reddish discoloration on his skin around both the neck area and one of the hands and wrists that was visible to Giesbrecht. One of the suspects had a distinctive speech pattern that Giesbrecht described as fairly high-pitched and sometimes very fast-talking, which could have been a pattern developed by Smith's rapid-fire and vitriolic firebrand speeches. One of the suspects wore 2-tone beige shoes and light brown Lightweight, almost tropical clothing which would indicate he just came from somewhere in a warm climate like the Los Angeles area where Smith just held his Citizens Congressional Committee meetings on January 19, 1964. Gostick, a Canadian resident, would not have worn that garb in the middle of February in Winnipeg, and Butler, who arrived in California in mid-January from Australia, knowing he was scheduled to embark on a tour across southern Canada, would not have been likely to have brought such an outfit with him to Canada. Smith or one of his other associates, the only Southern California residents, were most likely the beige, tropical outfit dresser, except for the fact that this person also had the Ukrainian accent. You can see that this is not going to be easy to solve from the descriptions alone. It will eventually be demonstrated beyond the shadow of a doubt that it was this North American tour that led to the meeting in the Winnipeg, Manitoba airport that was accidentally overheard by Richard Giesbrecht, the Canadian businessman. A recent disinformation-filled story was circulated on internet just before the Dallas 94 AS conference, according to Martin Shackelford, who received a printout of the message from Dr. Gary Aguilar, formerly an officer in William F. Buckley's training ground for nascent fascists, resurgent neo-Nazis, and stormtrooper followers from the Young Americans for Freedom, also known as Goldwater's stormtroopers, describing the preposterous claims of someone named Jules Kimball, who claimed that he and two friends of his were the ones present at the Winnipeg airport meeting. Kimball gave some feeble rendition of an innocent explanation of those events and essentially attempted to debunk the significance of Giesbrecht's observations. Reading through Alias Oswald that evening, I just happened to stumble upon the reference to the very same Jules Rocco Kimball, who was described as a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Does it not make perfect sense that neo-Nazis, fascists, and yuppie yaffers from YF and assorted right-wing John Birch and Liberty Lobby types would utilize a KKK member to construct a perfect, but completely phony alibi on their behalf? Birds of a feather flock together, as the old saying goes. Only true right-wingers would even consider originating or propagating a message like this and utilizing a source to divert attention away from Draper, Buckley, and Vonziatsky. The discussion in the Horizon Room of the Rosetta Stones of the John F. Kennedy assassination, the Winnipeg airport incident, the Raleigh phone call, and the Manchurian Candidate, by Richard Condon, as improbable and as amazing as this might seem to you at first glance, remember this for the rest of your life. Big Daddy, Warbucks, was Wycliffe Preston Draper, and Little Orphan Annie was Tsar Anastas Vonziatsky. They were the characters in the Chicago Tribune comic strip of the same name, which was owned and distributed by Colonel Robert McCormick, the scion of the McCormick Reaper family, called Internation Harvester. The McCormick and Draper families lost more leased equipment and money right after the Russian Revolution than any other families in the history of this conflict. Baldwin Locomotive, where Vonziatsky worked for several years right after the Russian Revolution, was the third family which suffered losses of both equipment and money plus any future business. John F. Kennedy was president of all of us, and the truth about his death belongs to all of us. Jim Garrison. For those who are not familiar with the story of the Richard Giesbrecht incident, I would refer you to the Third Decade, now called the Fourth Decade, published by Dr.